This is the Siècle, episode 46, Revolutions. Welcome back, everyone. Last time, I wrapped up my series on France's July Revolution of 1830, when King Charles X launched a coup against the liberal opposition and ended up losing his throne. Today, I could think of no better way to follow that up than a discussion with one of the world's preeminent experts in 19th century revolutions, pioneering history podcaster Mike Duncan. Many of you are probably familiar with Mike, but if you're not, know that his podcasts were the single most formative influence on the Siècle. If you're new here, welcome. The Siècle is a serialized narrative history podcast telling the story of France's overlooked century in between the fall of Napoleon and the First World War. I've just spent 45 episodes covering the Bourbon Restoration, from its beginnings in 1814 through to its collapse in the July Revolution. Fans of Mike Duncan's Revolutions will probably find a lot to like here. I recommend you start with episode 1 to hear the story from the beginning. Alternatively, if you just want to get a sense of what a typical episode of the show is like, check out episode 36, a standalone episode that will give you a good idea of the show's research and storytelling. You can find out more about how to subscribe to the Siècle at thesiecle.com/start. That's THESIECLE.com/start. You can also visit thesiecle.com/episode 46 for a full transcript of this interview. Finally, you can visit patreon.com/thesiecle, where all patrons pledging as little as $1 per month get ad-free feeds of the show. All these links are in the show notes. Now, without further ado, here's Mike Duncan. Mike Duncan, welcome to the Siècle.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm guessing that a lot of you listeners are already very familiar with Mike Duncan, but if you're not, I'd call him history podcast royalty, but given what we're talking about today, that might not actually be a compliment.
David, I'm merely the first citizen.
Mike is the host of the Revolutions podcast, which has covered historical revolutions from the English Civil War through the Russian Revolution into space and more to come, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Why don't you introduce yourself to anyone who doesn't know your background? Talk about how you got interested in revolutions in the first place, as well as other projects you have.
Hi, I'm Mike Duncan. I have been podcasting about history for a very long time now. I started the History of Rome podcast way back in July of 2007 and have been pretty much podcasting ever since then. I'm going to be coming up on the 20th anniversary of the History of Rome, like very fast, which is kind of insane. But after the History of Rome, I moved into doing the show Revolutions, which each season covers a different great political revolution in history. And this really goes back to revolutions and revolutionary events being kind of one of my first historical loves back when I was really getting into things as a teenager. I was really into the American Revolution and I was really into the Russian Revolution because I'm old enough to have been like I lived through the Cold War and I was sort of coming out of the Cold War. And so those revolutionary events that sort of got the United States started and the Soviet Union started were always really interesting to me. And then as the years went by, I just sort of continued to study it and learn about it. And when the History of Rome ended, the funny thing is that I wanted to next do a series that would be a little bit shorter and a little bit more compact. And I was meant to do the Revolutions podcast for like 3 years. And every season would be like 12 to 15 episodes. And then that all went to hell when I decided I could not cover the French Revolution in 15 episodes. That would be insane. And so that got me going on the version of the Revolutions podcast, which lasted for 9 years before I took a break and is now restarted and will be ongoing for a very long time, so far as I can tell.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about the future plans for Revolutions at the end of this discussion here. But in particular, I've invited you onto the Siècle because the narrative of the Siècle just finished with the July Revolution, or at least the exciting part of the July Revolution. When a revolution ends is a much bigger topic that may come up later. And you have not only covered the July Revolution yourself on season 6, I believe, of Revolutions, but you also, having covered all sorts of different revolutions in France and other countries in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, I think are uniquely situated to help put some of what listeners of the Siècle have learned about the July Revolution into a broader context.
Yeah.
Just to start, before we get into more detail, What stands out to you about the July Revolution as among all the revolutions you've covered? What makes this unique or interesting?
Well, coming out of, so the Revolution of 1830 is sort of after the first wave of the great revolutions, and really like the age of revolution and the age of Atlantic Revolution, which kind of covers the American Revolution and the French Revolution, Spanish-American independence, like all that stuff is sort of winding down when the Revolution of 1830 comes along. And the Revolution of 1830 to me feels like a real pivot point between the kinds of revolutions that were going on in the later 18th century and early 19th century and the kind of revolutions we would be looking forward to in the 19th century. Because by the time we get to 1848, which is, just a scant 18 years after 1830, that's when we really start getting into like labor being involved in things, and Marx is on the scene, and we're starting to get like real, like sort of the social revolutions that are going to be the engine of revolution going forward. And 1830 sort of exists in between those two, right? It's after the great liberal revolutions and before the social revolutions. And so that's kind of like as an ideological point, that is interesting to me. And then the other bit of it is sort of how the revolution actually unfolded, because 1830 is when we really start getting into barricade fighting in the streets and sort of like rapid fire insurrectionary events in the streets of Paris. And of course, things had happened. There were lots of street actions during the French Revolution, and there were barricades that had been put up in Saint-Antoine during the middle stages of the French Revolution. But this sort of like the iconic imagery of, the Parisians at the barricades really comes to us initially from 1830, right? And, liberty leading the people, like that famous painting is from the Revolution of 1830, which most people completely miss. They all think it's just from the French Revolution. So those two kinds of things, kind of like the mode that the revolution took, and then its sort of ideological meaning in the larger scope of revolutions, makes it like the July Revolution is like obscure, but it's also like fascinating and important in its own right.
It feels like it sort of, not just with the barricades, but in other elements of the revolution too, sort of sets a template that a lot of revolutions for the rest of the 19th century are imitating or trying to differ themselves from in varying ways.
Yeah, exactly. And, the social revolutionaries that come later are often, like they're kind of trying to repudiate what had happened in 1830, which they thought that 1830 was the victory sort of not of progressive forces of revolution, but of these conservative liberals who wanted to arrest the social revolution that they wanted. So for them, they would look to like 1832 as sort of the failed attempt at a second revolutionary wave that would have been the equivalent of like 1793 and 1792 in the original French Revolution. And then later liberals are going to be looking at that and saying, no, that's all we want. Like that's the extent of what we want out of a revolution. We don't want this social revolutionary stuff. So some people were looking back on 1830 and saying, yeah, that's the model. And other people were looking back on 1830 and said that was a job clearly half done.
Well, looking at any revolution, perhaps the place you have to start is what people are revolting against. And Charles X of France is a very interesting character, I found, certainly. I think you might agree as well. What stands out about Charles as a monarch, a target of a revolution for you, and how does he differ compared to other revolutions you've covered and who people were revolting against?
Charles X of France is one of our emblematic great idiots of history. Because one of the theses that has emerged from the Revolutions podcast, I didn't intend this going into it, it's just kept emerging over and over again, is that revolutions are not waged against competent administrations and people who are doing like a good job. They are rarely even against just a regime that is tyrannical and exploitive and abusive of people, because often those tyrannical and exploitive and abusive regimes are very good at doing those things. And so they keep revolution at bay. But Charles X comes into a situation where, conservatism, this is like the age of Metternich, right? Like conservatism kind of was the prevailing norm across Europe in the post-Napoleonic era. And even though there were nods to liberalism, there's a charter of government and there's a chamber of deputies and all that stuff. But really, like, it's really quite conservative. And if Charles had just done nothing and just sort of let events play out, he would have been fine. He could have, the monarchy would have stayed in place. The Bourbons would have stayed as the royal family of France. But instead, he comes in and immediately starts trying to drive everything back to like 1788. He wants to undo everything. He's been pissed off about the revolution since 1789. And yeah, I agree. Like Charles, who was once upon a time the Comte d'Artois, is a fascinating figure, right? He was the very first emigre out of the French Revolution. Like he split the scene in July of 1789, and he wasn't reconciled to anything that had happened since then. And even though there are, practical things that he couldn't undo, he couldn't re-seize those nationalized lands that had been sold off, after those properties were seized by the revolutionaries. And so he couldn't necessarily give people their property back, but he definitely wanted to use like state taxpayer funds to like reimburse all the old nobility for their lost property. And then he just starts coming hard at these like basic victories of the revolutionary era. Something resembling freedom of the press, something resembling freedom of speech, something resembling, participatory government, right? Those things existed. But in minimum ways, like there wasn't actually just blanket freedom of the press or blanket free speech. And, the electorate for the Chamber of Deputies and stuff was very small, but he couldn't even deal with that. So he just starts driving a political crisis against him, where when he comes into office, the French liberals are really, really, really on the back foot. I mean, Lafayette went back to do his grand tour of the United States in 1824 and 1825, partly because he was so kind of despondent about the state of liberalism in Europe. He had just watched the French army go in and conquer the liberal regime in Spain. And rather than that triggering like a mutiny or an uprising in France, the French just kind of went along with it. So he's like, God, we're never getting anywhere.
Plus the failure of the Carbonari revolutions as well that he was part of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The failure of all those Carbonari revolts. Yeah. And so he's despondent. And this is 1824. This is just 6 years before there is a full-blown liberal revolution against Charles X. And I don't think that revolution happens without Charles X being like a huge idiot about the things that he was doing.
One of the things that struck me about Charles and all this was, as you said, like had he just done nothing, he would have continued. But Charles very clearly didn't think that doing nothing was an option. He saw the relatively moderate gains of the liberals, the French liberals at the time, and thought it was unacceptable. But based on his memory of the French Revolution, he remembered, his brother being forced to fire his prime minister, and thought that sign of weakness was what kicked everything off. And he was determined not to make that same mistake. But he saw even demands for relatively moderate shifts to the left as slippery slopes that would doom everything. And because he thought those would doom everything, he pushed back really hard and ended up losing everything. Yeah,
for sure. And, of the three Bourbon brothers, the best of them was, in my opinion, was, Louis XVIII, right? So he sort of like operated in the middle ground between, the post, wanting to not have just the verdict of the revolution be the overthrow of everything that was good and pure about the Ancien regime, but having some sense of like what the practical lay of the political land was in the 1820s, which Charles was just going to be deaf to. Because, yeah, like you say, it's very similar to like where Charles I was during the English Civil Wars and where Nicholas is during the Russian Revolution, is these guys do believe that they have been like anointed by God to be the monarch of France or the monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland, or the monarch of Russia. And that they had like a sacred duty to keep those things in place and to restore those things. Charles was like really Catholic, right? He believed all of that stuff. And so, yeah, like he had internal justifications for what he was doing. It was just, he was blind and deaf to the realities of the world that he was living in the 1820s.
Your mention of Louis XVIII brings up something that I've wanted to talk about and get your reaction to, which is something that really struck me when I was writing about the 1830 revolution, is the comparison with the crisis of 1820, 10 years earlier, which, to remind listeners, the late 1810s had been sort of the liberal restoration period. Louis, under his advisor, Elie Decazes, had been making various liberal reforms. This was scaring a lot of the conservatives. They thought things were getting out of hand. And then the Duc de Berry, the effective heir to the French throne, got assassinated, and there was a huge crackdown. Royalists panic over liberals winning elections. They responded by imposing censorship, rewriting the electoral laws to privilege the richest voters, and they faced down street protests in response to that. But in 1820, the regime held. The protests were put down without serious violence. The regime was emboldened for another 6 or 7 years without serious challenge. Then fast forward to 1830, you have royalists panicking over liberals winning elections. They respond by imposing censorship and rewriting the electoral laws to privilege the richest voters. They face street protests, and this time everything blows up. They're very similar circumstances. I was wondering, with all the revolutions you've looked at, what stands out to you about this, and in general about what factors influence when a crisis like this spirals into revolution and or gets successfully managed by a government?
It's a really good question. And I'm not sure that I have a great answer for you, other than, there are some differences between Louis XVIII's personality and how he had been operating and how he had managed to at least co-opt and get buy-in from some of the more conservative liberals who existed out there, versus Charles X, who was far more confrontational and far more willing to alienate any and all liberals, right? He's not trying to placate anybody. And I think that plays a big role in it, right? And then there is, inside of, what's going on in 1820 is a European-wide issue, because the death of Berry was being linked to the liberal revolution in Spain. And so it wasn't just something that was happening in France. It seemed to be something that was much wider spread. And so there was a desire to clamp down on it, but also understand that they couldn't go as far as Charles wanted to go. I don't think that even Louis XVIII was going as far as Charles was going to go. And then it also comes down to sort of the way that the crackdown unfolded, where in the case of 1830, Charles is dropping Charles drops the 4 ordinances kind of out of the blue. And it's a direct and dramatic attack on what is happening, and is a direct attack on what is happening and has been happening for the previous 3 years, which is the liberals consistently gaining momentum and consistently gaining momentum because of the things that Charles is doing, disbanding the National Guard, but sending them all home with their guns. For example, that's where 1830 comes from, partly, is that all of those disbanded National Guardsmen still had their guns. And so when it was time to get together in 1830, they're like, yeah, we've got an armed National Guard ready to go to overthrow this guy. None of that existed in 1820. The liberals didn't have a ton of momentum going into 1820, and they certainly didn't have a completely disbanded National Guard that was fully armed, ready to, march into the streets of Paris and overthrow the monarch should it come to that. And then also, sometimes I think that there's a degree to which kind of the passage of time helps too, because in 1820, we are 5 years from the fall of Napoleon. They have just gone through an entire generation of war, struggle, turmoil, revolution. And I do think that there was probably some level of exhaustion with all of that was prevalent in 1830, that was prevalent in 1820, that was not prevalent in 1830 because some time had passed. And now you could look back on the revolution as something to inspire you and something to reach for, rather than something that is going to reopen the can of European-wide war, death, and destruction.
I want to press on 2 sort of very different explanations that I've seen and thought of comparing these two, which sort of push in different directions. One is contingency. In 1820, there was a big protest. There was marching of the Tuileries, and it started raining, and everyone went home. Mm-hmm. And 10 years later, it was hot and sunny the whole time.
Yep.
So the first, the degree to which just luck like that can affect things.
100%. Add it to the list.
And the second thing is the contrast between the management style of Louis XVIII's prime minister at the time, the Duc de Richelieu, who's generally comes off pretty well in the histories that I read, and Charles's prime minister, Jules de Polignac, who, to put it mildly, does not come off well in the histories. even among his fellow ministers.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Polignac is one of my favorite characters from all the revolutions that I have ever covered. And yeah, like personnel absolutely matters. Leadership absolutely matters. And Polignac was just the guy, my understanding of Polignac is that he had been like arrested during the revolution and spent a good period of time kind of in solitary confinement, or at least confined. And that he came out of this like a little loopy and a little off. And he was an arch conservative. And we should, of course, remember that the only reason he gets appointed as prime minister is because the liberals in the assembly are demanding that Charles get rid of his previous prime minister and put somebody new in the prime ministership. And they're all expecting him to go with somebody who is like more liberal, who will placate them. And instead, Charles reaches into the bag and pulls out like the most arch conservative person he can find. This is inflammatory and deliberately inflammatory. And that's also what sort of gets the revolution going. And yeah, if Polignac had been at all competent, they probably could have ridden this thing out. And for sure, like one of my very favorite moments, honestly, of all the revolutions that I have covered is in the Revolution of 1830. I think on the first night, Polignac and I think the Minister of the Navy. I think it's the Minister of the Navy who's telling this story.
Baron de Haussay.
Yeah, exactly. And they're walking along, and Polignac is like, "Oh, I suppose I should probably alert the troops that there's going to be trouble in Paris." And the Minister of the Navy is like, "You didn't alert them already? Like you knew you were going to drop the 4 ordinances. You knew that it would spark a backlash. You knew that it would be controversial. And you just didn't tell the army that you were probably about to spark a riot in Paris? Like, what are you doing?" And Polignac says, "It'll be fine." And then they're all overthrown like 3 days later.
That brings me to another topic I wanted to talk to you about, which is one of the very striking elements in 1830 was the role of what I call the softliners of the regime. The people who are fully supportive of the Bourbon Restoration. They're fair, they're conservative, but these people keep coming out of the woodwork to come to Charles and Polignac and say, "You're making a mistake. You got to change course or everything's going to fall apart." And they just get ignored. Softliner after softliner comes out of the woodwork, and eventually they get through, but too little, too late. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, is this archetype, did you see this as a recurring feature of other revolutions you've covered?
Yeah, there's always going to be a group of regime supporters who, their fundamental emotional state in the lead up to the revolution is frustration. And they are frustrated with the monarch. Supporters of the regime in, the English Civil Wars, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, like all of these, you find those people who are saying, if you keep doing these stupid things, we're going to lose everything. So we either need a more competent prime minister, or you need to hand off some of your decision making to somebody else. And sometimes in places, eventually it becomes like, we need you to resign or abdicate the throne in order to keep the regime itself intact. Like if you want the Romanovs or the Bourbons to continue to be the royal family, then you got to go. Like your heirs, your son, your grandson, whoever can become the new czar or the new king, but you've got to go. Because they are fundamentally frustrated with the incompetence that they are seeing among the people who are supposed to be the leaders and defenders of the regime that they themselves support. None of them are revolutionaries in any way, shape, or form. But like when Nicholas II abdicates, he doesn't abdicate because Lenin came and put a gun to his head and said, "It's time for you to abdicate." Like Lenin's not even on the scene yet. It's a bunch of Russian nobles and ministers on a train with Nicholas saying, "Dude, you have to go. Like the only way to save anything or salvage anything is for you to abdicate." But they don't want Tsarist Russia to end. They don't want the system to end. They're just trying to protect it. And yeah, that sort of like class of people and archetype of person is present in just about every revolution I've ever covered.
It seems like their behavior and where they come down can be a decisive factor in whether a revolution succeeds or not. Whether these people stay loyal to the regime or whether they start pushing it toward an exit.
Yeah, one of the things that, again, this emerged kind of organically from just trying to tell the stories of these various revolutions as they've gone on, is that revolutions don't happen just because the masses or the people or the proletariat rises up and overthrows their class enemies. It's always this big sort of hierarchical vertical structure that links disaffected nobles and elites at the very top all the way down to those people who are absolutely necessary. Like, the revolutions don't happen without those masses of people like rising up and taking out the Bastille and fighting on the barricades for 3 days. But that the disaffected nobility is really an important part of this. And one clique of them are going to be like what we would call the liberal nobles, who really do want like genuine reform. Like, they see the injustices and the things that are broken about the regime as it currently exists, and they want to change them and they want to reform them. And these guys are all over the revolution of 1830. This is Guizot. This is Jacques Lafitte, right? Who they want a different version of France, but have the elite capacity and money and resources and access to the inner circles of power to actually affect a regime change. And then you also have, as we're just kind of talking about, is the same class of people, except they're defenders of the revolution, but they've lost confidence in the sovereign himself. It's always himself. So far as I can, every revolution that I've covered, they're overthrowing a guy. But it's that level, that loss of confidence that does pull one of the like Jenga pieces out for the entire thing to fall over, for sure.
Just very briefly focusing on that other group you mentioned, the liberal reformers, the liberal nobility, the people who are okay with a little revolution, but not too much.
Yep.
I think it's not too much of a spoiler to say that this group often doesn't come out well in the end in a lot of these big revolutions.
Yep.
But 1830, they sort of do, at least in the short term. Can you talk a little more about these liberal reformers, these liberal noble types, and maybe what made 1830 relatively successful for this group?
Yeah, these are people, there's kind of two versions of liberal nobles. There's the liberal nobles who want to enact a bunch of reforms to the regime and change it and alter it in several ways in order to sort of protect the social system as it exists and the class standing of everybody. And they see revolutionary upheaval as a means of just getting the changes in place that will prevent further revolutions, right? Those guys don't actually want revolution at all. They don't actually want to be revolutionaries. They want the reforms to go in place to prevent a further revolution from happening. And I think in 1830, this is best represented by like Francois Guizot, who comes out of the French Revolution believing that the French Revolution was bad and terrible and didn't want to go through all that again. And he was going to do the absolute minimum amount necessary to prevent future revolutions from happening by enacting like very, very, very limited reforms. And then there's the liberal nobles who believe that the revolution is meant to be the first step on a larger process of like prolonged and large scale reform. And I think Lafayette is in that group of liberal nobles where, Lafayette comes out of 1830 and he thinks, great, we've done the first step. Next, we'll move on to like enfranchising more people, and then we'll like expand rights and we'll expand the electorate. And he himself finds himself on the outside by the end of 1830 because the party of resistance, which is those conservative liberals, are going to win in 1830 in a way that they did not win, as you say, in these other revolutions, or those people are eventually overthrown. And the big moment here is then nothing that happens in 1830, really. It's the failure of the revolution in 1832, the June Rebellion of 1832, which when you sort of track the course of other revolutions, there is that sort of first wave, often liberals, often led by the elites who want those kind of reform projects. And then 2 or 3 years later, there's kind of like a more radical uprising. And this is what, the August insurrection of 1792 is about. This is the difference between the February and the October revolutions in Russia. And in the case of the revolution of 1830, that is really what we see in 1832, when the collection of like these neo-Jacobin students and sort of junior officers attempt to do an insurrection of August 10th and overthrow the July monarchy because it had, because it had been betraying what they thought the Revolution of 1830 was about. And then that one, 1832 doesn't work because their numbers are minimal. And I think that there's also Louis Philippe is out there on the front lines. The National Guard stays with Louis Philippe rather than going over to the revolutionaries. And often in French history, it's like wherever the National Guard goes, that's the side that's going to win in whatever factional conflict is going on inside of some French revolutionary event. And in 1832, I think Louis Philippe shows real leadership. And instead of hiding in the palace, he goes out there on his horse and he's kind of on the front lines. And the National Guard really sticks with him. And so they put the rebellion of 1830, they make the rebellion of 1832 merely a rebellion and not a further revolution. But all of that just pushes it deeper into, it pushes it under the surface, but it does not make it go away. And so a lot of what happened in 1832 just comes roaring back in 1848 and then again in 1870. And so, yeah, they were successful for 18 years, but then they do ultimately all get overthrown in a further and more extreme and radical vision of revolution.
We'll be talking a lot more about the June Rebellion of 1832 in future episodes of the Siècle. Something else that really stood out to me about 1830 was just how fast it was compared to these other revolutions. Like, you look at the American Revolution, there were a lot of people who were squishy moderates at the beginning, weren't okay with independence, and eventually they came around, but they had months and months and months of time and pressure to evolve. People like Francois Guizot or Casimir Perier had to go from non-revolutionaries to revolutionaries over just the course of a couple days.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that makes 1830 more of a template for future revolutions a little bit, because it was, 1830 is like a lightning coup, more than anything else. It is done by an uprising of the people of Paris, but all of the initial fighting and everything was kind of just in Paris. It didn't have time to spread elsewhere. By the time most of the rest of France was even learning that there had been this revolt in Paris, they were also being told, oh, and by the way, it's over. The king has abdicated and Louis Philippe is your new king. And people were like, oh, well, I guess that happened. And there just wasn't enough support for Charles X out there really to push back against it. And it was actually one of the most surprising things is you sort of get into the aftermath of 1830 and the rest of France just kind of acquiesced to it very, very quickly. And I think it does speak a little bit to the general tenor of politics in the latter 1820s and then into 1830. Because because I wrote this biography of Lafayette, I am pretty intimately familiar with what he was up to. And there were a lot of campaign events and banquets and across France in 1827 and 1828 and 1829 that was building momentum for the liberal cause and really ginning up support for the liberal cause in all of those other French towns and French cities and French villages. So that I do think that they were all primed ultimately to be surprised by the news that there had been a revolution in Paris and Charles X had been overthrown, but not regret Charles X's overthrow and not really be like, oh, we need to push back on this or stop this. They were kind of just willing to accept it. It happens very, very quickly. Nobody expected it to happen. Again, there's a famous funny note from Lafayette where he's like, well, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back home because it doesn't look like anything is going to happen in Paris, at least until, September when we have these new elections that Charles has called for. And then days later, he's back in Paris putting on his National Guard uniform because there was a full-blown revolution.
It's as good a time as any to talk about Lafayette. You wrote a biography of Lafayette, the hero of two worlds. I'll include a link in the transcript of this episode for people who want to check that out. And Lafayette wasn't around for the first day and a half or so of the July Revolution. As you said, he was out in the country because he didn't expect any of this.
Because nothing was going to happen.
Which undermines the claims, some of the ultra-royalists, that this was all a conspiracy and was planned.
Oh, yeah, this is the printers. This is the printers getting pissed off.
But Lafayette ended up being pivotal, arguably the central character of the sort of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, these big events. Starting with sort of when he takes over the municipal commission, ending with his famous kiss on the balcony with Louis Philippe. explain a little bit more what was going through Lafayette's head. What was his role in all this? Obviously, he was sort of he was seen as really on the left, but then the true Republicans thought he was not nearly enough on the left. Talk about the role of the Marquis de Lafayette, or General Lafayette, as he preferred to be called.
Yeah, at this point, he wants to be known as General Lafayette. So Lafayette, after the Restoration, he gets back into politics, and he has been a liberal deputy off and on, all the way through between, I forget what year he was first elected, maybe 1818, maybe 1817, I forget. All the way through, and he's a delegate in the Assembly during 1830, and had tried and failed to stage like a revolutionary mutiny inside the army with the Carbonari in the early 1820s. And so Lafayette was personally not reconciled to the restored Bourbon regime. He thought that it was rolling back way too many things that were, in his mind, sort of final verdicts of the French Revolution that were being rolled back. Lafayette himself is still one of the most famous people in France. Like, people know the name Lafayette. This guy has been around since 1777. People have known the name Lafayette since 1777, since he first went to the United States. So he himself is a popular figure and a well-known figure. And there's a lot of people who will look to him, his connections to America, his connections to George Washington, the great Republican revolutionary, as somebody with an authoritative voice. And so when he comes into the Revolution of 1830, not having expected that it would happen, but, like, as soon as he finds out that it happens, he's like, yeah, let's go do this thing. And like, as soon as he comes walking in the door with some of the meetings of these liberal leaders that are taking place in Paris, he's like, yeah, the king's already abdicated. Like, by his actions, he's already abdicated the throne. And we can and should do everything in our power to make sure that abdication, which, Charles hadn't signed a piece of paper yet, to make sure that abdication happens. And then he goes forth with his fame, with his voice, and says, we got to overthrow Charles. And I think that him having that voice, affected people, and probably people who were on the fence about it were like, okay, well, Lafayette's going to go along with this. He becomes the pivotal figure, I think. This is one of the moments when Lafayette really influences the course of history, and maybe not in Lafayette's own mind, like, to the best result. Because he's the one who more or less secures the throne for Louis Philippe. I do think that it is Lafayette deciding to back Louis Philippe over some of the several other options that were available, because, historical contingency, like you say, exists. And there was at least 4 different options that were on the table coming out of the abdication of Charles. It was like his grandson could inherit the throne. The Bonapartists wanted to bring, an heir to Bonaparte back. Republicans wanted it to be a republic. And then there was this, let's give it to the cousin of the Bourbons, the Duc d'Orléans. And of those 4, Lafayette believed that transferring power to the Duc d'Orléans to make him King Louis Philippe was the path that was going to do the least amount of damage to France, the least amount of damage to Europe, not trigger a war, not trigger civil war. And that's what was really on his mind in 1830. And he's very clear about this. Like, he writes about this in various places, where in his mind, if they had, for example, gone with a Bonapartist candidate to succeed Charles X, that's bringing back Napoleon. Every other power in Europe is going to be scared and hostile to the restoration of the Bonapartes, because the Bonapartes just stand for war with the rest of Europe, and it probably would have triggered a war with the rest of Europe. And then he believed the same thing about a republic. Lafayette believed in republicanism, and he thought it was a good thing, and it was ultimately what every polity should be aspiring to. But the word, république and republic in the rest of Europe was, again, not a signifier of like revolutionary freedom and liberty, but war, just war. Like, the Republic declared war on the rest of Europe, and the rest of Europe declared war on the French Republic. And so to go with those things would so completely, inflame the situation elsewhere in Europe that those powers would almost feel obliged to, get their armies back up and running and reinvade France, which, remember, they had just done 15 years earlier. The only reason the Bourbons were in power was because the other European powers came in and installed them on the throne, and then kept them on the throne thanks to occupation forces that France was occupied for several years after 1815. And so he saw all of those things as being like, no, if we go with any of those other options, it's just going to be war, death, destruction, and probably the reinstallation of a Bourbon. And then Lafayette himself was now completely done with the Bourbons. He's like, these people cannot be in power ever again, right? Like, they're the worst. They're never gonna see reason. They're never gonna accept the verdict of the revolution. So they got to go. So the only thing that is left is Louis Philippe. And so Lafayette is like, okay, and Louis Philippe says the right things to Lafayette, and Lafayette lets himself believe all the things that Louis Philippe is saying. And I don't think it was necessarily, out of line for him to believe the things that Louis Philippe had been saying before he becomes king, because Louis Philippe had been more liberal, and the Orleans family had been more liberal. Louis Philippe's father was the Duc d'Orléans and then Philippe Égalité during the French Revolution, and had been a major player in the French Revolution. So I think that there was decent reason for Lafayette to believe that Louis Philippe would be on the side of sort of liberal reform and ongoing reform. And then, as it turned out, Louis Philippe was far more conservative and just wanted to do the bare minimum number of reforms necessary to quell the situation, and then nothing else.
And that's one of the things I'll be hoping to dive into in the next couple episodes of the Siècle, looking at the degree to which how contingent was the July Revolution's turn to conservatism, whether it's baked in or whether another route was possible. The comparison with England and the Reform Act is going to come up a lot. But I wanted to, you mentioned Louis Philippe and his father, Philippe Égalité. I think for the three main characters here, all old men, Charles X, Louis Philippe, and Lafayette, had all been active in the original French Revolution, and were all shaped by their experience there. I talked about how Charles X thought that there was the compromises that had kicked off the French Revolution, and how he was determined not to repeat that. Louis Philippe wrestled with accepting the throne to some degree because he was traumatized by his father's decision to ultimately betray the Bourbons and vote to execute Louis XVI. And he seems to have some genuine, real hesitation about repeating that by usurping the throne. And Lafayette, in the Bourbon Restoration, Lafayette was as left went in French politics. But of course, in the actual French Revolution, he was far outflanked by the Jacobins, and the Neo-Jacobins were still out there. And Lafayette was in a sort of ambiguous position where he was sort of a representative of the left, but was not the farthest to the left, and had these memories of what happened when the people farther to his left won.
Yeah, Lafayette was absolutely not on the far left. And again, then one of the things that'll happen in 1832 when you guys get to that is that, that revolt breaks out basically at Lafayette's feet. He was enough of a representative of sort of republicanism and revolutionary reform that they believed that if they went into revolt at Lafayette's feet in the midst of Lamarck's funeral procession, that Lafayette would lead them. And they tried to thrust the red liberty cap in his hand. And, the story is that he threw it to the ground because that red liberty cap represented to Lafayette sort of the dark turn of the revolution, which dispossessed him of all his property and killed most of the people in his family, like all of his in-laws, kind of get fed to the guillotine in 1794. And his wife would have been fed to the guillotine in 1794 had not, James Monroe and Gouverneur Morris intervened with the French Foreign Ministry and said, if you kill Lafayette's wife, you're going to have a big problem with the United States. But Lafayette also, even with all of those things that happened to him and around him, still believed that the revolution in itself was a good thing. It had just kind of been taken over by people who maybe weren't the best people to lead France. That's in his opinion. But the people who are, trying to rise up in 1832 are those neo-Jacobins who look at Robespierre and Danton, not as villains of the revolution, but as the true heroes of the revolution. And so, and then, Louis Philippe lived through all of this. He was a young man. He was a very minor figure in the French Revolution itself, because he was young. He served in the army for a bit and then basically had to run for his life and winds up, in exile in the United States for several years. But, he always fought under the tricolor. That's what you can always say about Louis Philippe. He fought under the tricolor. And that was really the only thing anybody knew about him. But yeah, Louis Philippe definitely, it was traumatized by the things that happened, and more than Lafayette took the lesson from that being, we need to put a lid on revolution as quickly as possible, even if it serves our political interests. And Lafayette was like, let's let it play out and try to get as much out of this as we can. But even Lafayette has his limits to how far he wants it to go.
By the time this episode comes out, you will have finished up your series on the Martian Revolution, which is the sort of fictionalized retelling of a revolution that's drawing on all these actual historical revolutions.
Yeah.
Talk a little about this project and what, if anything, you've drawn from 1830 in particular to inform some of these characters and events that you've talked about in this fictional story of the Martian struggle for independence.
Okay, so what I did, I did this ridiculous thing where I took everything that I have learned about the 9 or 10 revolutions that I covered before now, up to sort of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and kind of extracted from that large archetypical patterns of the course of events. Again, I mentioned this a couple times. There's usually like a first wave, and then there's a second wave that overthrows them, and there are liberal nobles, and there's an idiotic, sort of sovereign who's making a hash of things that allows all this to get going in the first place. And then there's radicalization, there's civil war, there's, counter-revolutionary royalists. Like, all of these things kind of exist in all the different revolutions that I covered. So I extracted all of that and then used that architecture and all of those events and examples and painted over it a story that is a fictional historical account of a revolution on Mars in 2247, which is told from the perspective of a narrator who is living 250 years after the revolution happened. So he's able, which is basically like we're 250 years from, the events of the Atlantic revolutionaries. So that's basically what I'm going for here. And so that narrator is able to look back, with the fullness of time. We have all the sources. We've lost some sources. There's historiographic debates. There's an entirely made up bibliography that explains, that like if you want to learn more, read this book. And all of this is just, I'm making it up off the top of my head. And I'm running through the structure and the patterns of historical revolutions, but doing it in an entirely science fiction setting for the fun of it, because I think it's really fun, but also because it's just another way of looking at and examining the historical events that inform this story. And people who listen to all the episodes of Revolutions before they get to Mars can look and say, oh, Vernon Bird, that's very clearly like Porfirio Diaz. And that guy over there, he reminds me of, that looks like Danton and Desmoulins, and that's a Lenin figure. And, all of those things exist in there. And so it's just kind of a different way to think about revolutions. When it comes to 1830 specifically, I think the main things are I definitely had to have barricade fighting, because barricades become like one of the physical symbols of revolution and have been ever since. So there's definitely barricade fighting in the Martian Revolution. And then there's also sort of in 2247, when the first revolution happens, there is inside of the elite, sort of the local Martian elite, there are sort of liberal nobles who want independence for Mars and who want to reform the social system that they had been living under, represented by one of the main characters whose name is Mabel Dorr. And then there's also in that same group, those conservative liberals who were I don't really want to reform the social side of things. Independence for Mars is good, but I don't want to do the rest of it. And I think I was thinking a lot about what happened sort of after the July Revolution as one of those archetypical moments when you do get a split amongst those sort of conservative, moderate, and more extreme liberals, outside of the more radicalized sort of social revolutionaries that are going to rise up and overthrow them, which ultimately does have to happen in the Martian Revolution, because that's what happens in revolutions so very often.
Are there any other thoughts you had about the July Revolution that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you wanted to be sure to share before we wrap up this part of our talk?
There's nothing that immediately springs to mind, except that, the revolution of 1830 it's a very undercovered revolution. But it's it's very entertaining. There's a lot of entertainment value in the Revolution of 1830. There's some good characters doing some kooky stuff. And really, like, in the end, like, the Revolution of 1830 should have never happened. And it happened because, again, the 1830 becomes one of the sort of pillars of this idea that it's incompetent leadership more than anything else that will trigger a revolution. And when I talk about that out there in the world, you know, the examples I am always pulling from is Charles I of England, Scotland, and Ireland, who just, there was no reason for any of that to have gone on. He just made it happen with his own stubborn insistence on ruining everything. And Charles X of France is like my next like principal go-to example, him and Polignac. So sort of understanding what happened in 1830, I think, does give you a great perspective on that part of a revolutionary event, which is like how leadership can so fundamentally blow a situation that they trigger a revolution that never should have happened.
I wanted to wrap up our talk by pulling away from the history to talk about this medium that we both share of narrative history podcasting. Mm-hmm. You've been doing this for a lot longer than I have, but what attracts you to this medium? What do you think it does well as a medium for teaching and learning history, and what are its challenges and shortcomings? Well,
the main thing that podcasting gives people is something to listen to while they are doing something else. And I think that that's really kind of where podcasts live inside of people's lives. Certainly that's how it lives inside of my life. That if you ask people, like, when do you listen to podcasts? It's when I'm doing the dishes. It's when I'm exercising. It's when I'm, stuck in a car on a commute. Those are the times that people engage with podcasts. You rarely hear people saying like, oh, I listen to podcasts when I sit on the couch and just listen to the podcast and nothing else. That's not really how I think people take our shows in. And what's great about that is that what that gives us really as a society is an opportunity for people to learn about stuff and be educated about things that they would not otherwise be educated about because they're learning about it when they're busy doing something else. And if we forced people to rely only on books or TV shows or video documentaries or, whatever that requires kind of their full attention and not doing anything else, I think that we are missing out on a golden opportunity to turn all of these kind of drudging moments of our lives into something that is actually worthwhile and beneficial and like enriches our lives. So that's the thing I like best about podcasts. And that's what I think we do best is we turn those, boring and sometimes like really aggravating moments in the case of like a long commute and makes it something that is fun and enriching and great. The challenges of it are, of course, that like there's no visual component at all. And so like, you can obviously put it on YouTube and you can have videos and pictures and stuff being shown, but it's an audio only medium. And so it's more difficult to just kind of like flip back and say like, wait, who was that person again? Which I do all the time in books. Like, wait, who is this guy again? And then I can flip back like 3 pages real quickly and be like, oh yeah, it's that person. It's much harder to do that in an audio podcast than it is like with a physical book. And then, of course, it just comes down after that to how well you work on and craft the narrative and how hard you work at making sure that you get your information right. Because we do live in a world of misinformation and disinformation and people, sharing things that are just like completely dead wrong. And like, I'll listen to history podcasts or watch history documentaries and I'm like, well, that's not true. And that's not true. And like, where are you even getting any of this stuff? And so that stuff is also proliferating in a way that is like, yeah, how do we ever check the spread of like wrong information? But from my perspective, and I'm assuming from your perspective, the best way to combat this is to know for ourselves how much time we put into reading the sources, understanding what happened, and only telling stories that can be backed up, in books and from primary and secondary sources to make it like a solid narrative that's actually educating people instead of misinforming people.
Plus occasionally maybe 1 or 2 quotes that are just too good to check.
Yeah, of course. There's a little bit of print the legend in there,
I think that's particularly the case in July 1830 because a lot of what we know about it comes from people's memoirs written years after the fact, in which everyone comes off suspiciously prescient about the dangers of what was going to happen, and it's always a little uncertain about how much one could trust all that.
Yeah, and I think all throughout the Revolutions podcast, and even going back to like Roman history, because this is even more true in Roman history, where you've got stuff written 500 years after the fact by like some random senator who was like not even close to there and doesn't even have primary sources. So it's important to keep the listener sort of constantly reminding them that like, yeah, we're getting this from memoirs, and memoirs are entirely self-serving, and we're getting this from somebody who was not there. We're getting this from somebody 100 years after the fact. Like, as long as I think you introduce the notion that there is ambiguity and there is trouble with the sources, and some things we're never going to know and some things are clearly biased, as long as you're pointing those things out, I think we're setting our listeners up for success. Sometimes
someone just has to have reportedly said something.
Yeah.
If you look at the leaderboards of the most popular history podcasts out there, you're on there, Revolutions is on there, but a lot of the other most popular podcasts are episodic. They do a different thing every week. You've done serialized narrative history where you're telling a long-form story over many episodes that are designed to be listened to in an order, which can be a heavy lift for some people. What attracted you to the serialized form of storytelling rather than sort of jumping around and doing self-contained capsules that look at particular incidents?
This, I think, is simply an accident of me getting it in my head one day to write a complete narrative history of the Roman Empire back in 2007. That's what I wanted to do. It didn't even occur to me to do sort of one-off episodes, or like I'll be a history podcaster who covers like this event and this person and that person. And every episode, you can kind of come into it cold and just listen to it from start to finish and get a little capsule bit of history. Because the original vision for the history of Rome was a huge, all-encompassing, single-voice narrative history of the Roman Empire, because that didn't really exist. And I thought that it was something that I wanted to exist, but did not exist. And so I made it exist. And that process of, spending 5 years writing a narrative that covers 1,000 years of Roman history. Like when I went into Revolutions, it was just that. It was like, I had the idea of doing it somewhat episodically in terms of like each series will be a different revolution. But within those revolutions, it is a big continuous narrative. You are not meant to start anywhere but at episode 1 of a given revolution. And if you just try to hop in, you're never going to know what's going on, because it's a soap opera, in a lot of ways. This is running soap operas, and you don't have any idea what happened before. But that's just how I've always done things, and other people do history podcasts their way. And I think that there's enough of those out there that I don't have to change my mode of operation, even though when I'm like, oh yeah, I did this great series on the Russian Revolution, and somebody who's never listened to the show is like, oh great, how long is that? And I'm like, oh well, it's 103 episodes, and it's I don't even know how many, 100 hours of material or something. That's probably an exaggeration, but yeah, it is a big lift. And then people are like, oh okay, well maybe I'll try that another time, because asking somebody to listen to 103 episodes on the Russian Revolution is like a big thing. But I believe that my success and my continued success, and the reason I'm still able to do this all these years later, is that once people start at episode 1 and get into the story that I'm telling, I can keep people coming along with it, week after week. You do want to find out what happens next, and then you do want to find out what happens next. And the next thing you know, you started at episode 1 of the Russian Revolution, and you're at episode 103, and you're like, oh, well, I actually kind of want this to keep going. This has been great. So yeah, it's a big ask and it's a big lift, but long form narrative history podcasting is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life.
You had a moment near the end of the Russian Revolution series where you went through and tied all the threads together, how things you've been talking about for years had all come together in this moment. I imagine that must have been very satisfying to you from a storytelling perspective, as it was to me listening to that. I think it speaks to the power of this serialized narrative where you are able to cover lots of disparate events that all come together at the end, because of course all these things are having impacts.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing that I really like about the long form stuff is that Like, I can just take the example of the French Revolution because it's right there. It's like a lot of times when you do the French Revolution, there'll be like, there's a lot of information about 1789 and the fall of the Bastille. And then maybe you get into like 1792 and 93 and 94, like the Committee of Public Safety and the Reign of Terror. And then you kind of skip to, okay, and then Napoleon comes along. But in between those moments, those big moments that are always covered that would get like a standalone episode treatment, we skip over 1790 and 1791, which is like 2 full years of events that, you know, come from what happened in 1789 and build towards 1792. That if you just look at, okay, I want to learn about the insurrection of August the 10th, you don't really have the background to understand what actually happened. Whereas if you follow me through, I will tell you all about the sort of the obscure stuff that happened in 1790 and 1791. And then later, like after the fall of the Committee of Public Safety and after Robespierre gets overthrown, after Thermidor, you know, the several years of the Directory is often very neglected by history, but you go through that stuff and you understand where the Napoleonic Empire comes from. You understand how France went from being like a really like sort of chaotic mess to like this authoritarian war machine. Like those things happen in 1795 and 96 and 97, which are always ignored. And so I always love when I get to the parts of these stories that are not usually covered, because there's always interesting stuff happening in there, and they always better inform the big events that we're, you know, sort of expecting to be talking about.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Mike Duncan, thank you for coming on the show. Tell people about where they can find more of you and your history podcasts and books and other projects, as well as what's next for you.
Well, you can find both the History of Rome and Revolutions anywhere fine podcasts are found. You know, we're everywhere. You can just search for Mike Duncan or Revolutions or the History of Rome. And I have, as we just talked about, a lot of material for you to go through at your leisure. I also wrote a book called The Storm Before the Storm, The Beginning of the End of the Roman Republic, which covers the couple of generations before the arrival of Caesar to explain what was going wrong inside the Roman Republic that leads to, you know, the overthrow of Caesar, which actually gets right back to the point I was just making, where like everybody wants to talk about Caesar and I want to talk about what happened a generation or two before Caesar that allows Caesar to be a thing. So that's what The Storm Before the Storm is about. And then also, hopefully of interest to all of you out there, I wrote a biography of the Marquis de Lafayette called Hero of Two Worlds, which is a cradle-to-grave biography of Lafayette. Takes him from birth all the way through to his death in 1834. We cover 1830 in great detail. All the events of, you know, 1820s I cover in great detail, because one of the reasons why I wrote that book is that typically biographies of Lafayette cut off when he gets expelled from the revolution in 1792. And it's like, okay, then he wound up in prison and then, you know, he retired and later came back for this tour of the United States. But no. Lafayette was deeply and heavily involved in French politics and revolutionary politics all the way to the end of his life in 1834. So both of those books exist. I've just wrapped up the Martian Revolution series. So if you are listening to this, you can start at episode 1, and it's a 29 episode long history of a revolution on Mars in the far future. And so you can get at that. And then once I am finished with my third book, which is another book about Roman history, it's going to be about the crisis of the 3rd century. Once that book is done and written, I return to Revolution's history podcasting full time, and we'll pick up with new series that pretty much start after World War I, because I left off with the Russian Revolution in the early 1920s, and I'm just going to sort of pick things back up and cover all of the 20th century revolutions that everybody wanted me to cover, and now I will.
Let it not be said that the people don't get what they want in the end.
Right. Yeah. I'm nothing if not a man of the people.
All right. Well, Mike Duncan, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Mike, for coming on the show. This episode was transcribed by David McLean. You can read the full transcript at thesiecle.com/episode 46. That's THESIECLE.com/episode 46. Thank you also to the Siècle's network, Evergreen Podcasts, and to the show's Patreon supporters. Since the last episode came out, new supporters include Sam R., Olivier Dubois-Matra, Brian Gold, Atari Anushiravan, and Eugène Delacroix. They and all other subscribers get access to an ad-free feed for as little as $1 per month. Join them at patreon.com/thesiecle. Now, I'm headed back to the books to finish up the next episode, where we'll return to France as the dust settles after the July Revolution, and the victorious politicians and people have to decide what kind of country they want this revolution to create. Join me next time for episode 47, The July Settlement.